The log entry that started everything was not dramatic. I am Cale Darrow, and I wrote it on paper, which tells you something about how remote survey outpost Saren really was. Our digital redundancy systems had been cycling an error flag for 19 days, and the replacement parts were still 4 months out on a supply run, so I had gone back to physical records the way my grandmother's generation used to keep them. Pen, ruled notebook. The kind of documentation that did not require power, did not require a network connection, and could not be accidentally transmitted to anywhere it was not supposed to go. That last part mattered more than I knew at the time. The entry read, Day 291 at Saren. Vith Corridor Colonial Monitoring shows Outpost Delenn silent as of 0400. Standard 48-hour grace period before escalation. Note, Delenn went silent 13 days after Probe Array 7 completed its biological survey pass of the corridor's inner ring. Coincidence. Log it anyway. That was the whole entry. I almost did not write it. Coincidences happen in deep space constantly, because space is vast and colonial outposts are fragile, and there are 100 mundane reasons a small station stops transmitting. Equipment failures. Solar interference. Budget cuts leading to skeleton crews who forget to run the morning check. Delenn had 58 people on it, small enough that a single bad week could knock out their entire comms team. I logged it because I log everything. Xenobiology field stations at the edge of surveyed space exist precisely to notice things that nobody else is positioned to notice, and the most important thing my training ever gave me was the understanding that significance is not visible in single data points. You need the accumulation. You need the patience to write down the thing that does not yet mean anything, so that when it starts to mean something, you have the record of when it began. Thomas Baresh, my systems tech and the only other permanent resident of Survey Outpost Saren, brought me the next piece 14 days later. Station Calvin is quiet, he said, setting a mug of something hot beside my notebook. He said it casually, the way you report weather. Missed their morning sync. I flagged it to Colonial Oversight and they say they'll look into it. I looked at him. When did Probe Array 4 complete its biological pass of the Calvin sector? He checked. He came back looking less casual. 18 days ago, I opened my notebook to the Delenn entry and read it back to him. We stood there for a moment in the particular silence of people who have just noticed something they cannot unnotice. It's probably a coincidence, Tomas said. He said it the way people say things when they already know they don't believe them. Probably? I agreed. Then I sat with the notebook open in front of me and a cup of cold tea I had forgotten to drink, and I understood that I had a problem that had nothing to do with xenobiology and everything to do with the fact that I was a junior survey chief at a remote human outpost. Make me a list of every probe array pass completed in the corridor in the last 2 years, and map them against every colonial communication gap longer than 24 hours. He had the list by morning. I went through it 3 times, then a 4th. And what I was looking at was going to require someone far more important than me to take seriously. The pattern was not subtle, once you knew to look for it. Every colonial station that had gone silent in the Veth corridor over the past 23 months had done so within a specific window following a probe array survey pass of their region. Not immediately, not during the pass. Afterward, in a range between 8 and 29 days, with a median clustering around day 14, the silence was not the silence of equipment failure. Stations that went quiet from equipment failure sent fragmented signals first, or their emergency beacons tripped automatically, or they came back online after a few hours when someone rebooted the right system. These stations did not come back online. And when Colonial Oversight sent follow-up probes to check on them, the worlds were there, the structures were there. The equipment was there, idle and intact, air pressurized and powered and completely empty of the people who had been living inside them. 58 people at Delenn, 124 at Calvin. A research station at the edge of the Tereth Belt with 34 people aboard, gone quiet 27 days after a survey pass, follow-up probe finding a half-eaten meal on a table in the common area, and every airlock sealed from the inside. I wrote the full analysis in the notebook. Then I wrote a summary document for transmission. Then I sat with my hand over the transmit key for a long time before I sent it. Sub-Director Omoth Vreen of the Concordance Bureau of Colonial Oversight was, by all accounts I had managed to gather in advance of our communication, a methodical being. The Pelhari as a species were methodical by nature. They had been administering colonial territories across 6 sectors for longer than humanity had possessed writing. And in that time, they had developed institutional responses to essentially every category of problem a colonial oversight body might encounter. Their filing systems were legendary, their response protocols were thorough, their patience with uncertainty was, by their own proud assessment, essentially infinite. What they were not, as a culture, was comfortable with problems that did not fit existing categories. I had prepared for this. I had my notebook. I had Tomas's correlation maps. I had 23 months of data showing a pattern so consistent that I had been able to predict, within a 4-day window, when Station VETH-9 would go quiet based solely on when Probe Array 12 had completed its survey pass of their region. Station VETH-9 had gone quiet on day 13. I had written down day 12 as my estimate. Sub-Director Vreen reviewed everything I sent. He was efficient. He came back to me within 48 hours, which for concordance bureaucracy was essentially instantaneous. "Station Chief Darrow," he said, his image steady on my comm screen despite the light lag. The Pelhari had pale, wide-featured faces and very calm eyes, and his calmness now felt to me like a thing he was working to maintain. "We have reviewed your correlation data. It does not mean we take your proposed mechanism seriously, because your proposed mechanism requires us to accept that something is detecting and responding to our probe arrays across distances that make coordinated response essentially impossible, and doing so selectively. Our analysts find the pattern statistically notable. Statistically notable is doing a lot of work in that sentence," I said. "It means we take it seriously as a data set," he said. "And taking people without leaving any physical trace of how or why. I know what it requires. You are a xenobiologist, station chief, yes. Not an astrophysicist, not a first contact specialist, not a xenopsychologist. Also, yes. Subdirector, I don't know what this thing is. I'm not claiming to. I'm telling you what the data shows, and the data shows that every time we send a probe array into a populated region of the corridor, people stop existing within a month. I'm asking you to stop sending probe arrays." The silence that followed was the kind that has texture. "Station Chief Darrow," Vreen said carefully, "what you are asking us to do is suspend the entire colonial monitoring program for the Veth corridor. The monitoring program exists to protect those colonies. Without it, we have no way of knowing if a station needs medical support, evacuation assistance, emergency resupply. Without it, we stop losing people. You are theorizing that we stop losing people. What you are describing could be explained by a dozen other mechanisms, a pathogen triggered by probe array emissions that then produces rapid behavioral changes leading to collective departure from stations. A series of coincidental equipment failures that your correlation is retroactively organizing into a pattern that feels causal but may not be. How many more stations have to go quiet before those alternatives stop being more comfortable than mine?" He did not answer that. "An indigenous corridor entity that is reactive to probe frequencies but poses no ongoing threat beyond that specific stimulus. Immediately, I'm going to escalate your report to Director Counselor Shivan," he said. "This is above my authorization level. I want to be transparent with you about that, and I want to also be transparent that Director Counselor Shivan will not find this an easy report to receive. I know. She will push back. Harder than I have. I know that too." He looked at me for a moment with something that was not quite sympathy, but was adjacent to it. "Why are you certain enough to keep pushing?" he asked. It sounded like a genuine question rather than a challenge. I picked up the notebook and held it toward the camera. "Because I wrote it down," I said. "Not in the system, on paper. Because our digital redundancy was broken, and I was logging by hand. And the reason that matters is that this notebook has never been transmitted. It has never been processed by the monitoring network. The paper record of my correlation existed for 3 months before I digitized it and sent it to you, and in those 3 months, nothing came for Saren." He was quiet for a moment. You believe the act of transmitting your analysis put your station at risk. I believe the act of observation is the trigger. I believe this thing, whatever it is, detects when it is being looked at. And I believe that right now every probe array active in the corridor is a liability. That is an extraordinary claim. Subdirector. I put the notebook down. I know exactly how extraordinary it is. I have been sitting with this data for weeks, trying to find a way it isn't what it looks like, because I am a scientist and I understand that the conservative explanation is usually correct and the extraordinary one is usually wrong. But I keep running the numbers and the numbers keep coming back the same way. And while I have been running the numbers, 4 more stations in the corridor have gone quiet, and Colonial Oversight has sent follow-up probes to each of them, and in my projection that means 4 more stations in the corridor are now on a 14-day clock. Another silence. I will escalate immediately, he said. Director Counselor Siobhan was everything Vreen had implied she would be, and then, more besides, she had been administering Concordance colonial territories for longer than my entire species had been space-capable. The Pelhari measured career distinction in terms of crises resolved without escalation, and Shivan's record was, by all accounts, exceptional. She had managed resource conflicts, territorial disputes, first contact protocols for 4 separate species, and a colonial collapse on the far side of the Veth corridor 7 years before my posting that had required evacuating 2,000 people in under 2 weeks. She was competent in a way that had calcified over decades into something that looked a great deal like certainty. She gave me 4 minutes. I know because she told me at the start of the call that she had 4 minutes. Station Chief Darrow. We will note your concern in the station log and continue standard monitoring operations. Director Counselor. I have reviewed Subdirector Vreen's summary of your report. Your correlation data is interesting. Your proposed mechanism is not credible. I need more than 4 min. You have 4 minutes because I have 23 other stations in the corridor and a review board meeting in 40 minutes and a probe array deployment schedule that serves 14,000 people across this sector. They have reviewed yours and assessed it as a pattern requiring additional observation before conclusions can be drawn. Additional observation is exactly what I'm asking you not to do. What you're asking me to do is leave 14,000 colonial citizens without monitoring coverage based on a theory produced by a single xenobiologist at a remote outpost who is not with respect. Your correlation is one data point among many that my analysts review monthly, trained in the disciplines that would qualify her to assess an entity of the type she is describing. The her landed slightly wrong because Siobhan had clearly not checked my file, but it was not the moment to address that. Director Counselor, I said, keeping my voice as level as I could manage. In the time we have been speaking, the monitoring network has processed 7 automated check-in signals from stations in the corridor. Each of those signals goes through Probe Array Relay Station 4, which means each of them is now a data point in whatever observational process this thing uses to locate populations. You are asking me to take the entire colonial monitoring network offline based on a theory that an entity we have never detected, characterized, or even confirmed exists is using our own infrastructure to hunt people. Do you understand how that sentence sounds? I understand exactly how it sounds, I said. I also know what the data shows. The data shows a correlation that may or may not be causal. Correlation is not causation. I know. I have a doctorate. Director Counselor, I can predict within a 4-day window which station will go silent next based solely on the probe array schedule. Station Relen 7 completed their standard check-in 24 hours ago. If I am right, if you are right, it is one more data point that brings us closer to understanding the mechanism, at which point we will be better positioned to respond appropriately. If I am right, Probe Array 9 finished its biological survey pass of their region 10 days ago. In my projection, Relen 7 has between 4 and 19 days before it goes quiet. If I'm wrong, you lose nothing by watching that projection fail. There are 91 people on Relen 7. She ended the call with 2 of my 4 minutes unused. I called Vreen afterward. Not because I expected him to overrule his director counselor, but because I had nowhere else to put what I was feeling, and he was the only person in this chain who had looked at me like he was actually listening. She dismissed it, I said. Yes, he said. He did not seem surprised. She's going to keep running the arrays. The monitoring schedule is considered essential infrastructure. Suspending it requires authorization from the full Colonial Administration Board, which meets in 58 days. 58 days. I did not have the energy to make it a question. I am sorry, Vreen said, and he sounded genuinely like he was. How many people are in the corridor right now? I asked. Approximately 14,000 across 29 active stations. I looked at my notebook at the numbers I had run so many times the page was slightly worn at the edges. Subdirector, I said carefully. I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to think about it as a person, not as a bureaucrat. He was quiet for a moment. Ask, if you were on one of those stations right now, if you were one of those 14,000 people. And you found out that someone had data suggesting the monitoring probes were the mechanism by which you were being located and taken. What would you want the person with that data to do? A long pause. The light lag made it longer. I would want them to keep pushing, he said at last. Even if it was inconvenient, even if it was embarrassing, even if it made them look like the kind of person who sees danger in coincidences. Yeah, I said. Me too. Relens 7 went quiet on day 13. I had estimated day 14. The follow-up probe Colonial Oversight sent to check on them found the station intact, powered, pressurized, with 91 personal effects still in 91 small rooms and 91 half-finished projects still open on 91 workstations, and no indication of where 91 people had gone. I sent the timestamp of my prediction alongside the report. I also sent the notebook pages, scanned, not retyped. I wanted them to see the handwriting, see the dates in the margins, understand that this was not a retroactive reconstruction. This was a record kept in real time by someone who had not yet known what they were looking at and had written it down anyway. Vreen forwarded everything to Siobhan. Siobhan's response came through official channels addressed not to me but to the Sithani Compact Survey Corps Administration. It described my ongoing transmissions as disruptive to colonial operations and requested that Survey Corps consider reassigning me to a posting outside the corridor region. Thomas read it over my shoulder and was quiet for a moment. She's trying to remove you from the data, he said. She's trying to make the data go away by removing the person pointing at it. What do you do now? I looked at the notebook. The probe array schedule is public infrastructure. It's not classified. And the colonial check-in logs are public record. Families of colonists have access to communication status for basic emergency purposes. I picked up my pen. I'm going to write to every family representative with a person in the corridor whose station is scheduled for an array pass in the next 30 days. Thomas stared at me. That is either going to work or it is going to end your career. My career ends anyway if she gets that reassignment through. And if I'm right and I stay quiet, 14,000 people are on a clock. I can read and they can't. He sat down across from me. What do you need me to do? Help me find contact information for 29 stations worth of family representatives, and make sure our own transmitter array is logged as inactive in the monitoring system. He raised an eyebrow. The probe arrays detect active communication transmissions, I said. If we're going to keep making noise, I'd rather not broadcast that Sarin is a busy station. You think it can find us through our own comms? I think it found Relens 7 through a check-in ping. I'm not taking chances. We spent the next 2 days pulling together contact records. The Sithani Survey Corps maintained emergency family notification databases for all colonial postings, and because Tomas had clearance to access those records for legitimate welfare check purposes, we were technically not breaking any rule by pulling them. We were, however, doing something their intended purpose had never been designed to accommodate, which was using them to conduct an unauthorized end run around the Director-Counselor of Colonial Oversight. I wrote each letter by hand first, then typed them out. The handwriting was a habit by then. I kept a copy in the notebook of every letter sent, dated, with the station name and family representative contact beside it. The letters were careful. I was not trying to cause panic. I was trying to give people enough information to ask the right questions of the right authorities, because authorities respond to organized civilian pressure in ways they do not respond to isolated junior survey chiefs. I wrote something like, I am a researcher at Survey Outpost Sarin in the Veth Corridor. I'm writing to all family representatives in this area to make you aware that this concern has been escalated to the appropriate authorities. I have been tracking communication patterns in this region for 23 months and have identified a correlation I believe warrants urgent attention from the Concordance Colonial Administration Board. Your family member station is in a region I am monitoring closely, and to encourage you to file your own formal inquiry with the Bureau of Colonial Oversight requesting a status update on any suspension of probe array activity in your loved one's region. I let them draw the conclusion themselves, because conclusions drawn by the reader land harder than conclusions handed to them, and because I wanted the questions they asked to come from genuine worry rather than from following my argument. You have the right, as a registered family contact for a colonial posting, to request welfare check documentation at any time. I did not say, I believe something is using our probes to find and take people, which they could dismiss as fringe or motivated. Thomas read the draft of the first letter. This is careful, he said. I've been thinking about what went wrong with my approach to Siobhan, I said. I led with the mechanism. I should have led with the pattern. People can dismiss a mechanism. They can say it's speculative. It's unsupported. It requires accepting too much. But a pattern is just numbers. A pattern is just, here's what happened, here is when it happened, here's what preceded it each time. The pattern doesn't require them to believe anything about what's causing it. It just requires them to look, and once they're looking, the mechanism becomes obvious on its own. He was quiet for a moment. What if this doesn't work either? What if the board meets and they decide Siobhan is right, and your data is speculative and they leave the arrays running? I had thought about this. It was the thought I had been sitting with for days, the one that kept me awake, the one I had no good answer to. Then I go public, I said. Full data release. Everything in the notebook, everything in the correlation maps, every prediction and its outcome. I put it in the public record where any journalist, any independent researcher, any colonial resident who wants to check my math can do so. That ends your career. My career already ended when Siobhan filed the reassignment request. I picked up the pen. Within 8 days of my letters going out, the Concordance Bureau of Colonial Oversight was fielding 400 formal inquiries from family representatives, demanding to know whether the monitoring schedule had been suspended pending investigation of the correlation data a survey station chief had apparently been raising for. And 14,000 people are still in the corridor. He did not argue. He helped me address the envelopes. The families made noise in the way that families of people in danger always make noise, which is to say loudly, persistently, and across every available channel simultaneously. Months, within 10 days, 3 human members of the Colonial Administration Board had filed a request for emergency session. Within 13 days, Director Counselor Siobhan had formally censured me for unauthorized communication with civilian colonial contacts. The censure was, in its way, confirmation. You don't formally censure someone for raising a concern you genuinely believe is unfounded. You censure them when their concern is inconvenient, and the difference between those two things is one I was counting on people to notice. Vreen notified me of the censure through a private channel, separate from the official documentation. His message read, "The emergency session is scheduled. You will be asked to present. I recommend you bring your notebook." I brought the notebook. Instead, it was a medium-sized conference room on a Concordance administrative hub with bad lighting and chairs that did not fit human proportions, and around the table were 14 beings from 7 different species. I had expected the emergency session of the Colonial Administration Board to feel like the council chambers I had seen in documentary footage, grand spaces designed to communicate institutional permanence. Most of whom had the particular expression of people who had been pulled away from other urgent work and wanted this resolved quickly. Director Councillor Siobhan sat at the table. She did not look at me when I entered. Vreen was there too, in a junior seat along the wall without a place at the table. He caught my eye when I walked in and gave a small nod that could have meant many things and that I chose to interpret as encouragement. I presented for 22 minutes. I did not use visual aids because I wanted their eyes on me and on the notebook rather than on a display they could argue about technical details of later. I laid the notebook on the table and opened it to the first Delenn entry and read it aloud. Then I walked them through the accumulation, station by station, array pass by array pass, prediction by prediction. I told them about Rillen 7. I told them about my 4-day error margin on a prediction I had made 10 days in advance, before the station went quiet, before I had any confirmation I was looking at anything real. I told them what I thought the mechanism was. I said I could not prove causation. I said the correlation was now 29 stations strong across 23 months, with a prediction accuracy that would be essentially impossible to achieve by chance. I said that the follow-up probes sent to investigate silent stations were, in my best assessment, not helping. They were compounding the signal, telling whatever this was that these locations contained populations worth taking. Then I said the hard part. The only intervention I can propose, I said, is the one that sounds the most counterintuitive. We stop looking. We pull every active probe array out of the Veth corridor. We suspend automated check-in pings for all 29 remaining stations and switch to physical courier relay for welfare checks. We go, as much as we possibly can, dark. We stop broadcasting that these places are inhabited. The room was very quiet. Not the polite quiet of people waiting for me to finish. The different kind, the quiet of people recalibrating. A board member I did not recognize leaned forward. You're asking us to give up our monitoring coverage. Our ability to respond to emergencies in the corridor for a defined period, yes, until we have data suggesting the thing has moved on or lost interest, and if a station has a genuine emergency in that period, medical crisis, equipment failure, violent incident, then they handle it with their own resources, the same way colonial stations handled everything before monitoring infrastructure existed. It is not a good option. I know it is not a good option. I'm telling you, it is the least bad option I can find given what the data shows. The least bad option, another board member repeated. She was Pelhari Sr. from her insignia, and she looked at me the way I imagine scientists throughout history have been looked at when they said something true that nobody wanted to accommodate. Station Chief, do you understand what you're proposing means in practice? Colonial stations in the corridor were built on the assumption of monitoring coverage. Their emergency response protocols, their medical supply chains, their evacuation planning, all of it assumes we can see them. You are proposing that we tell 14,000 people in those stations that we are choosing to stop watching them. I'm proposing we tell them we believe they are safer if we stop watching them, I said. And I'm proposing we tell them why, honestly, completely. Let them understand what the data shows and let them make their own decisions about what they want to do with that information. Some will want to evacuate. Some should. The stations nearest to the most recent array passes are on active windows right now. Voluntary evacuation is a reasonable choice for them while transport can still reach them without triggering additional signals. You've thought about the transport window? She said. It was not quite an accusation. I've thought about very little else for 3 months, I said. Siobhan spoke for the first time since I had entered the room. She had been sitting very still, watching me. Not the way Vreen watched with sympathy, but the way a judge watches a closing argument, trying to find the flaw that will let her rule against it without guilt. What you are describing, she said, requires this board to accept that an unknown entity has been systematically taking people from our colonial stations for almost 2 years, that our monitoring program has been functioning as a targeting system, that we have been, through the responsible exercise of our oversight duties, delivering our own citizens. She stopped. Not for effect, she stopped because she had arrived somewhere and needed a moment to exist there. Yes, I said. That is what I'm describing. The silence stretched. I watched her face, and I saw the thing that made me understand she was going to be different from what she had been in our first conversation. She had done what bureaucrats with long careers sometimes do when they finally encounter a problem their category system cannot accommodate. She had stopped trying to fit it in. It is a specific thing to witness, that moment. The internal structure of a well-organized mind encountering evidence it cannot file. I had watched Vreen do a smaller version of it, privately, over the course of several conversations. Watching Shivan do it in a room full of people with the weight of 14,000 lives sitting on the table between us was something different. She did not show distress. She showed the very controlled stillness of someone making a hard decision in real time and not allowing herself the luxury of making it slowly. "Sub-Director Vreen," she said, without turning to look at him. "What is the current probe array schedule for the remaining 29 stations in the Veth corridor?" From his seat along the wall, Vreen said quietly, "Array 7 is currently mid-pass over stations 14 through 19. Array 2 completed its pass of stations 22 through 24 4 days ago." Siobhan closed her eyes for a moment. "Stations 22 through 24 are on a 10 to 25-day window," she said. "By Station Chief Darrow's model." "Yes," Vreen said. "How many people across those 3 stations? Station 22 has 34 people. Station 23 has 19. Station 24's is a 2-person outpost. 55 people." I had run this number so many times in my head that hearing it spoken aloud by someone else in an official proceeding made it land differently. Numbers in a notebook are abstract. Numbers spoken in a room by a sub-director of colonial oversight are 55 specific people who do not yet know they are on a clock. Siobhan opened her eyes. "Suspend Array 7 immediately," she said. "I want every active probe array in the corridor on standby hold within the hour. Do not send follow-up probes to any station regardless of communication status. Switch the entire corridor to physical courier relay for welfare checks." She paused. "And draft a full board resolution formalizing the suspension with my authorization. I want this on record as a decision I made, not something that happened by accident." I had not expected that last part. I had expected, if I was lucky, reluctant compliance. Not someone explicitly choosing to own the decision in writing. "Director Counselor," one of the board members began, "we have been running these arrays for 2 years," she said. "We have lost people from 29 stations. We sent follow-up probes to every one of those stations." Her voice was even. It was the voice of someone holding themselves very still. "I want it on record. Every choice that led here, including mine." The board member who had begun to object fell quiet. Around the table, I watched 14 faces absorb the shift in the room's gravity, the moment when the most senior person present stopped defending a position and started inhabiting its consequences. In my experience, that is the only moment when institutions actually change direction. Not when the evidence becomes undeniable, not when the arguments run out. When the most powerful person in the room looks at the numbers and says, "I want this on record," and means it. Vreen caught my eye from his seat along the wall. His expression was difficult to read precisely, but it contained something I had not seen there before, something that looked like relief that had been held for a very long time and was only now being allowed to exist. The suspension held for 91 days. In those 91 days, no station in the Veth corridor went quiet. Not one. I know because Tomas and I tracked every courier relay welfare check manually, logging each response in the notebook alongside the last date of any probe array activity near that station. 29 stations, 91 days, 0 disappearances. After 23 months in which the corridor had lost an average of 1.3 stations per month, the silence was so complete it felt like held breath. The courier relay system was slower than automated pings. Each welfare check took between 2 and 5 days for a round trip, depending on relay distance. What we lost in speed, we gained in something harder to quantify: the certainty that a response was being made by a person, not transmitted by a machine, and that no machine signal was broadcasting the location back into whatever was watching. We heard from Station 22 on day 8 of the suspension. The station chief there, a woman named Barisov, whom I had never met and would not meet for another 8 months, wrote a 4-sentence response to the welfare check form. The last sentence said, "Please tell whoever made this decision that we would like to buy them a drink when this is over." I taped that page into the notebook. Station 23 wrote back on day 10. Station 24's 2-person crew wrote a joint letter that ran to 3 pages, and which I did not read carefully because it was personal and not intended for me. But I held it for a moment before forwarding it to the family contacts on record and thought about how it felt to be 2 people in a small outpost who had just learned that something had been looking at the lights they were making. Their note was brief and practical, a list of supply needs for their next courier rotation. Normal, the specific irreplaceable normal of people who were still there, and that someone had finally turned those lights off. On day 87, Vreen called me through the private channel we had continued using since the board session. He looked tired in the way that people look tired when they have been afraid for a long time and are only now beginning to be less afraid. "The board wants to know when it will be safe to resume monitoring," he said. "I don't know." I said, "I don't know what the thing's patience is. I don't know if it's still there, waiting, or if it's gone somewhere else. I don't know what it is. What do you recommend?" I thought about it. Extended silence, minimum 1 additional year before any probe array is reactivated in the corridor. And when arrays do go back online, I'd recommend staggered single array passes with a 90-day observation window between each one before proceeding to the next. I paused. And I'd recommend we never send 2 arrays into the same region in overlapping windows again. If we've been giving it a brighter signal by layering our coverage, we should assume that effect persists. "A year," he said, "and potentially longer." "I'm a xenobiologist," I said. "I study things for decades before I understand them. A year isn't long when what you're trying to understand is something that takes people without leaving evidence. Director Counselor Shivan would like to speak with you," he said, "when you have time." I thought about my last 3 conversations with her. "Is she going to reassign me somewhere?" Something that might have been a smile moved across his face, which was not something I had seen from him before. "No. She's going to offer you a position on the Corridor Monitoring Review Board. Permanent civilian advisory seat. Not because I didn't want to help, but because the most useful thing I could do for the corridor was stay at Saren, where I could watch and note and keep the physical record that no monitoring network could provide. She said to tell you that the Concordance could use someone who writes things down even when they don't yet know what they mean. I did not take the advisory seat, because physical records cannot be detected by something that hunts through observation. I explained this to Shivan in our call, which was different from every prior conversation we'd had. She listened without interrupting. She asked 3 questions, all of them precise and practical. She said at the end, "I spent 30 years being very confident that I understood the categories of problems this bureau would face. I did not understand that the most dangerous category would be the one where we were the instrument." She paused. "I want you to know that the formal censure has been removed from your record." "I know," I said. "Vreen told me." "I want to tell you myself," she said, "because I wrote it, and I should be the one to say it was wrong." I looked at the notebook on my desk. Page after page of handwriting that had started as routine field documentation and had become, somewhere along the way, the most important record I had ever kept. "Director Counselor," I said, "can I ask you something?" "Yes." "When did it change for you? When did you actually start to believe it?" She was quiet for a moment. "When you said you had written the first entry before you knew what you were looking at," she said, "before you had a theory, before you had a reason to connect those 2 pieces. A scientist recording data that doesn't mean anything yet." She stopped. "That's not the behavior of someone manufacturing a pattern. That's someone doing their job in a place remote enough that no one was watching, with equipment broken enough that they were writing by hand and noticing something anyway." Another pause. "I have been doing this work for a long time. I know what motivated evidence looks like." "Yours didn't look like that?" After the call ended, I sat at my desk for a while, looking out the observation window at the edge of the Veth corridor. Stars I had learned to read like a second language over 3 years at Saren. Dark bands between them where nothing I could detect was moving, or where something I could not detect was waiting, or where there was simply nothing at all. I could not know which, and that was the shape of the problem now. The thing I had spent months trying to make the Concordance see was that the not knowing was real, and that not knowing required a different response than the institutional reflex to send more instruments, gather more data, look more closely. Sometimes the correct response to not knowing is to go quiet, to watch without broadcasting that you're watching, to write things down on paper, in a notebook, in a station at the edge of known space, and wait for the accumulation to tell you what it means. Thomas knocked on the doorframe. Array 7 just confirmed standby hold. All 29 arrays are offline. He held up a handwritten log sheet. I'm starting the physical record. What do you want to call the new volume? I looked at the notebook. Volume 14 worn at the spine, written in blue ink across 91 days of noticing something no one wanted to hear. The cover was soft from handling. I had never expected, when I opened it on day 1 at Saren and wrote my first routine entry about solar wind patterns and biological survey protocols, that this particular volume would end up mattering to anyone outside my own filing system. That is the thing about writing things down before you know what they mean. You do it because the alternative is losing the accumulation, and the accumulation is the only thing that turns noise into signal. The individual entry is nothing. That reflex, combined with broken digital redundancy and a supply delay that had kept us using paper for 19 days longer than necessary, had produced the record that had saved. I did the math sometimes late at night, when I could not sleep, somewhere between 2000 and 4. The pattern across entries is everything. And the pattern only exists if you were patient enough, or disciplined enough, or simply habitual enough to keep writing even on the days when nothing seemed worth writing. I had been at Saren long enough that writing was reflex. 1,000 people, depending on how you modeled the trajectory of station losses over the following year without intervention. 2,000 to 4,000 people. From a notebook, Volvia 15, I said. And use the good paper. I have a feeling we're going to be at this for a while. Thomas nodded and went back to his desk, and I heard the scratch of pen on paper begin in the next room, quiet and steady, the oldest kind of record-keeping there is, the sound a species makes when it is paying attention, when it has decided that the small accumulation of noticed things matters, even when, especially when, no one is watching it accumulate. Outside the observation window, the corridor was dark and still and silent, and I chose, for the first time in months, not to try to see what was in it. I left the monitoring equipment dark. I left the observation arrays offline. I sat with not knowing, which is a harder discipline than looking, and watched the stars burn the way they had burned before any of us arrived out here to observe them. They did not need our observation to exist. They did not need our instruments to shine. I wrote that in the notebook, too, on the first page of Volume 15, and then I closed it and let the corridor be quiet, and trusted that quiet to be enough. Station Chief Cale Darrow, Survey Outpost Saren, Observation Record, Volume 14, Final Entry, Day 91 of Suspension. All arrays offline, all 29 stations reporting in via courier relay. No disappearances this month, no disappearances last month, no disappearances the month before. The thing either doesn't know we're here, or it does and doesn't care, or it's waiting for us to look again. I don't know which. I'm writing it down anyway. K. Darrow,